Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another Political Current episode. I'm your guest host Hassan Shami, and today we're speaking with Rania Khalek, a Lebanese-American writer, political activist, and journalist at Breakthrough News. She joins me today in breaking down all the latest developments happening in Lebanon and Palestine as ceasefire agreements take effect. Rania, thank you for joining us on the Political Current. It's great to have you today.
Hassan, it is great to be on with you.
Well, let's get right into it. So you're currently in Lebanon, right?
Yes.
And how long have you been there?
Well, I came just before the ceasefire ended. And aside from the holidays elsewhere, I've been here since then.
And have you visited the South and any other areas? Well, why don't you tell us about some of your observations and some of those sites have been destroyed and whatnot?
Sorry, I should say I came before the ceasefire started, so I was here actually during the war. And I actually hadn't been south until last week. And I went to Sur, which is a city in the south. And then a bit south from Sur to a few villages. And I mean, look, with Sur, I was expecting it to be a lot worse than it was. I guess because I remember the Israelis putting out a map uh where like half of the city, and Sur is like an ancient coastal city that has like a lot of Roman ruins in it, a beautiful old city area. It's like on the coast, and it's the favorite beaches are in Sur. It's like a beautiful area, just beautiful place, beautiful people. And the Israelis during the 2 months of just constant bombardment in October, November, they put out this map. Avikai Adri, the Israeli spokesperson for the Arabic speakers, put out a map of Sud, and half of it was covered in red, meaning you had to evacuate. So I thought half of it was going to get bombed. And there was a lot of devastation in Sud, but it wasn't like everywhere. It would just be every few streets, like 2 buildings would be destroyed. So that was pretty jarring to see. So it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it was still pretty devastating to see. And there were just pictures of martyrs everywhere, pictures of Hassan Nasrallah or posters of Hassan Nasrallah and of Nabi Berri, the leader of the ML movement, um, and Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the Al-Quds Force in the IRGC. And then in the villages I went to, I mean, there was a lot of destruction. It was like maybe 30% of the housing was bombed. And a lot of battles had taken, well, not really battles, there were fighters like in the villages from the villages who had been martyred. And so their posters were all around the village because people were really proud. I mean, there was Hezbollah flags and ML flags everywhere and like posters of Hassan Nasrallah. And I just mentioned that to say it's important to note that, people who live in the areas that were devastated are still very much supportive of resistance. Um, they're proud of their martyrs, and they all told me, like, we don't wanna fight again, but if we have to, we'll always fight Israel when they invade Lebanon. So I just say that to say that, anybody sitting in Washington or in Tel Aviv who believes that this war somehow diminished the resolve of people in Lebanon, in South Lebanon specifically, to fight Israel, I mean, they have another thing coming to them.
Yeah, I know we've seen a lot of video footage coming out of the South, even the deep South, where Israel is still placed in, where fearless women were just going up to the tanks with their arms wide open, like, "What are you going to do? Kill me?" And then we're reading reports of civilians pushing out Israel out of their villages. So, and I know you mentioned there wasn't too much destruction as much as you thought there would be, but the further south you go, I believe there are some villages are completely annihilated. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to go that far south because I went before the ceasefire ended, the 60-day deadline, even though it's now been extended. And so there were some no-go areas still because the Israelis were there, and there's still a few where the Israelis are. So those border villages, that like 5 kilometer area of Lebanon right next to the border, 3 to 5 kilometers, Israel just completely destroyed like every single structure in a lot of those villages. And it's the damage. I mean, the damage is really extreme, and they did that for a specific reason. They were trying to create a buffer zone. The Israelis wanted to create a 5 kilometer buffer zone on the Lebanese side of the border, where nobody could live. And the reason they wanna do that, you have to destroy everything and destroy everything that sustains life in order to make it unlivable, right? And the reason they wanna do that is because when it comes to a settler colony like Israel, actual people living in the areas you want to control are the threat. It's not like Hamas or Hezbollah, it's people. because if just having a populated area, just having a population live there, they're going to be hostile towards you if you're an aggressive settler colonial entity that wants to steal their land and subjugate them. So a buffer zone means a no man's land, and that's what makes Israel feel safe. Is the more areas it can create where there are no Palestinians or no Lebanese, the more secure, Israel is. I mean, and Lebanon's also different than Palestine in the sense that, yes, Israel has this, aspires for this greater Israel project, which includes pieces of Lebanon, includes pieces of Syria and Egypt and Jordan, and of course, all of historic Palestine. Um, but it's when it comes to Palestinians, it's like those are the areas they want first and that they're settling. They already know what it's like to occupy Lebanon, and it's difficult. They don't actually have the appetite to militarily occupy populated parts of Lebanon. They're happy to take territory that doesn't have people on it. So, in the Israeli mindset, the more territory of Lebanon you can remove the population from, the more easy it is for them to hold. They cannot hold or occupy areas where there are people because people will fight them, whether they're called Hezbollah or ML or something else.
Or
So,
just ordinary civilians, like we're seeing in the videos.
yeah, exactly. Like that's what was so incredible about what we saw on
The
Sunday.
resistance didn't have to do anything. It's as if the civilians just went in and started pushing them out.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing because there's these areas where nobody's been except the Israelis have been occupying, and just the mere presence of people of the land. These are not just like random Lebanese people from other parts of Lebanon. People went back to their villages, right? And despite the fact that their villages are rubble now, they walked back on foot if they had to, if vehicles weren't allowed through. And you saw in a lot of these cases, the Israelis fired at people and killed some people, but they actually ended up withdrawing and retreating because again, the Israelis do not have the appetite to militarily occupy populated areas of Lebanon. And what was really important is that the people who went back on Sunday, they brought tents with them because their houses are gone. So just putting up tents and staying present will make the Israelis ultimately leave because they already have hostile Palestinians to deal with in order of clearing land there, which they're actively settling. They're not in a position to do that in Lebanon right now. So, and I think there's something else that was really interesting to see on Sunday and really moving, seeing people go up to Israeli tanks and confront them the way they did, despite the real danger, because Israel killed 22 people on Sunday and injured over 100. Um, People still feel compelled to go back to their villages because that is their land. Whereas you have these Israeli settlers who have not gone back to the north yet. Even though Hezbollah hasn't fired anything at the north in months because they've abided by the ceasefire, unlike the Israelis. So that danger isn't really there, and they don't feel compelled to go back the way that Lebanese people do because it's their land. Whereas with the Israelis, they're just a bunch of settlers. They don't have the same connection.
So you talked about a little earlier the extension of the ceasefire. So the 60 days was supposed to be on the 26th or 27th of January, and now
26th.
what is it?
It was on the 26th on Sunday.
And now they're saying February 18th, I believe. Um, Israel and America have already agreed to this. The Lebanese government, have they agreed? Or, what do you make out of this?
So, I guess the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Najib Mikati, made a statement that basically, like, we will abide by our side of the ceasefire, which is essentially like implying you'll accept the February 18th extension. I mean, it doesn't really matter though necessarily what he says because he's not in charge of Hezbollah, and the resistance is in the hands of Hezbollah, not in the hands of the Lebanese government because Lebanon has a weak state that can't defend itself. That said, I think Hezbollah will abide by it in the sense of like they're not going to give the Israelis would like for Hezbollah to respond to all of these ceasefire violations so it can give them the excuse they would like to carry out more aggressive attacks against Lebanon. But I don't think Hezbollah is going to give them that excuse. And don't forget, like, the Israelis had to agree to a ceasefire. They were pushed out of southern Lebanon, and that in and of itself is a kind of victory. But there was also a lot of losses in this war. I mean, the entire senior leadership of Hezbollah was assassinated by the Israelis. That was a huge loss. They lost, and their communications was completely infiltrated. And these are things that after the fact, there was also a lot of devastation. People's homes have been lost and entire villages have been wiped out. So there's a lot of regrouping that needs to be done now that the dust has settled. You have a new secretary general. A lot of reshuffling needs to take place and a lot of reflections after, like any war, what went right and what went wrong. And so for any military organization after a war like this, like it, they are going to take a step back and assess the damages and reassess how they go about doing things, because there will be a next round. I just don't think it will be right now. And so they're being very restrained in how they respond, because when you respond to it's not just like Israel used to be. This is a different Israel. It's the Netanyahu-led Israel. And when you respond to this version of Israel, you're going to get the ferocity of what we just saw. So you need to be prepared for it. So for that reason, I think Hezbollah is going to stay as restrained as possible. And also, you know what? Let the state deal with it for once. Because we do have a state, we do have an army, and this is demonstrating to the population here why we have a resistance in the first place. Because the army in Lebanon is not capable of fighting Israel, and it's not even allowed to fight Israel. So I don't think you're going to see a reigniting of this war anytime soon. I mean, just yesterday, the Israelis struck vehicles in Nabati, which is north of the Litani River, which is outside the bounds of, the supposed quote unquote one-sided ceasefire agreement that Israel's been violating over 1,000 times. And you didn't see a response to that, because they're going to stay restrained as long as they can to regroup, reshuffle, and also not give the Israelis or the Americans any wiggle room to say that Hezbollah violated the ceasefire.
Now, do you believe with the new government, President Joseph Aoun and the restructuring of the government, that the Lebanese government will try to disarm Hezbollah anytime soon? And if they will try, do you see any success with this?
They can't disarm Hezbollah. They cannot do it. Like, there are certainly people in Lebanon who would love to disarm Hezbollah and would love to make peace with Israel tomorrow, normalize with Israel. The Lebanese government is so weak. It is a government that's so weak that where politicians are up for buying by the highest bidder. There's a lot of external influence and intervention in Lebanon. It's a sectarian system that was imposed on this country, but keeps it intentionally weak to the point where it can't defend itself. That's why Hezbollah exists. And even if tomorrow Hezbollah were to cease to exist, something else would take over, because people in the South need to defend themselves in their villages. Until the state or the army can do that for them, they'll always have to organize on their own, the way they have under an umbrella group like Hezbollah. That said, I think that there's a lot of nuance here in terms of the Lebanese army. Like, a lot of people like to say, oh, the Lebanese army is just a tool of the Americans. The Lebanese army relies on the Americans for hand-me-down night vision goggles and like old Kalashnikovs. And that's all it gets. The Americans will never give the Lebanese army weapons to fight Israel or anything that could ever pose a threat to Israel. And the Lebanese army also depends on the Qataris to fund their lunches for their soldiers and their salaries, right? So it's not exactly like an army that can necessarily serve Lebanon if it's dependent on these outside powers for its existence. That said, the Lebanese army is made up of people from every single sect. I mean, there's people in the Lebanese army who have family members in Hezbollah. So even if, like, the dream of the Americans is for the Lebanese army to be a counterweight to Hezbollah and to actually fight Hezbollah and disarm Hezbollah. But you're not going to see that. It's not going to happen. Like, I think there are people who would quit the Lebanese army if it actually took upon its like most priority issue, disarming the resistance, because there's people in the Lebanese army from the South. And don't forget, the Israelis killed members of the Lebanese army during this war. Just on Sunday, they killed 2 soldiers in the Lebanese army and injured a bunch of others. So it's like, yes, the under 1701, the army's supposed to go and like clear out Hezbollah weapons from the South. And they will do some of that in coordination, by the way, with Hezbollah. Hezbollah will hand some of them over, the weapons. But they're not going to be able to disarm them. Hezbollah is still going to maintain its arms. It's still going to be an armed movement. And they will continue to be as long as they have to be, because Lebanon needs a measure of self-defense. And with regard to the Lebanese government, I mean, yes, there's a new president, Joseph Aoun, that came on the backs of the Americans. There's no question about that. Had there not been this war, he probably wouldn't have become president. He also, though, wouldn't have become president if Hezbollah had not voted for him. So Hezbollah is still important politically. It's still the most important and powerful political force in the country, even if it's been somewhat weakened after this war in like a material way. So Joseph Aoun didn't just get elected by America. Hezbollah voted for him, right? So there's, inside Hezbollah, there's a view that this is not the person we necessarily want, but it's somebody we can accept and work with on some level. So I think with the new government, we have to wait and see. I don't think it's as simple as just saying, this is America in charge now. Lebanon is still a very polarized and complicated political makeup, and Hezbollah is still a very important and powerful political force in this country that can make or break the government.
You mentioned Hezbollah voted for the new president, but there was a strategy there, right? In the first round, they didn't vote purposely, and they didn't
Yes.
get enough votes to win. So there was like
Mhm.
more of a leverage, like you need us in order to become.
Yeah. Well, it was also to remind their adversaries in this country that they shouldn't be counted out. They still matter because there are people in this country who are in positions of power in parliament, and various parties, political parties, that because Nasrallah was killed and because Hezbollah took on a lot of blows militarily, that as a result, somehow that means they've been defeated in the country. So that was an important demonstration that no, we still have power here. Do not count us out. Like you don't, you can think you're victorious, but here's how the real world works.
So some speaking about Hezbollah and as a resistance power, some people say that there's perceived setback with the fall of Assad, right, in Syria. So how do you see Hezbollah moving forward? Are they still a big regional power, or is it going to be more localized? What do you see Hezbollah as now?
I mean, there was a period of time where Nasrallah was the resistance axis. Like this man was the resistance axis, and Hezbollah was the most important part of it. Um, I think now you're going to see Hezbollah definitely localized, and they should focus locally on Lebanon because a lot of destruction has been wrought in Lebanon. Um, and also losing Syria as an ally was a huge loss. It wasn't necessarily Assad. It wasn't like Bashar al-Assad and nobody else. It's just who took over is the problem. Who took over is HTS, a group that is actively and openly hostile to Hezbollah, to Iran, to the resistance axis, and has signaled repeatedly that they want to at some point normalize with Israel or have a better relationship with the Israelis. That's a huge problem. The fact that the Israelis were able to, after the fall of the Syrian government, and the rise of Mohammed al-Jolani and HTS, take over huge portions of the Golan on the Syrian controlled side, especially Mount Hermon or Jabal al-Sheikh, which is like a very, very important mountain peak that overlooks a huge portion of South Lebanon. That's detrimental to the resistance in Lebanon, militarily and materially speaking. There's been a lot of talk about, of course, the weapons flow, right? Like Syria was a highway. I mean, I've talked to people. There's people who feel like that's not the big issue. Hezbollah is still going to be able to get weapons. Really, no matter who. I mean, Syria is such a huge place. They can also still buy weapons. So there's, different viewpoints on how important that part is. But the biggest problem is Syria is a huge country. It's Lebanon's neighbor, and it now has in power a government that is hostile to resistance, and that is what is detrimental, even more so than what happened during the war with Israel in terms of being able to maintain the same level of support for resistance that they had before. That said, I don't think that means that it's over. It's like Israel won. It just means that this is another complication and challenge.
Let's talk about Jelani real quick and the HTS takeover. You mentioned, he opposes the axis of resistance, and in some articles we've seen and whatnot, he's actually open to having good relations with Israel, while Israel is, has taken over more territory in Syria and whatnot. So, what do you make out of the pro-Palestinian supporters who are supporting Jelani and HTS?
I think it's completely outrageous for a number of reasons. And I want to be clear when I say this because people will misconstrue it and cut it up and say she said this when I didn't. This is not to say that the previous government in Syria deserved to stay in power. They made many mistakes. They behaved in horrible ways. And Syria always deserved better than Baathism and, the same family maintaining power forever. That said, what has taken over is people who are not going to be any better. In fact, these are people who, when you look at the region, the biggest threat to the Levant is Israel. They want to eat up everyone's land and ethnically cleanse any areas that have Arabs in them. They are a tool of American empire in the region. This is the biggest threat to the region. And until you deal with that threat, you can't really deal with much else. And to have a government in a country as important and as huge as Syria is, be talking about normalizing with Israel, that's horrific. And also, this is a country that historically, people can say what they want about whether, the Assad family did enough for Palestine. They always played whatever was best for them. And sometimes that benefited Palestine and sometimes it didn't. That said, they still played host to Palestinian resistance groups. That day is over, right? Completely over. On top of that, like if you have a government that, I want you to look at Jordan and Egypt and the role that they play in the region. That's the future we're looking at for Syria, but one that's more chaotic and unstable than Jordan and Egypt. Because they normalized. Are their economies any good? Are their people doing great? Not really. They normalize and they actively help Israel perpetuate genocide. During this 15 months of genocide on Palestine, they allowed the Americans to use their airspace and the Israelis to use their airspace to shoot down missiles that were headed for Israel. That is playing a role in the genocide. They helped the Egyptians keep the border closed in Gaza while there was a genocide taking place in Gaza. It's just completely insane. They basically do security for Israel and the Americans. They have zero sovereignty whatsoever. And they are horrific police states. So that's the future we're looking at for Syria. But like I said, more unstable and chaotic with a Libya flavor. Now let's look at the social fabric of Syria. Syria has been a pluralistic country with different sects that can operate freely. And now what do we see happening? Everybody wants to pretend it's not happening and like Syria is a rosy free place now. But people in Syria who are minorities are being killed right now. And people want to dismiss this and say it's made up. It's not made up. I know there's like lots of videos that have been going around and some of them are from 10 years ago. Some of them are also from today. There are foreign HTS mercenaries in Homs and Latakia and Tartus that are treating minorities horribly right now. I have contacts in Syria who are, finding dead people on the road in the Homs countryside with their throats slit. People are being kidnapped and ransomed. And everybody wants to just say, oh, this is just, score settling and revenge against Assad criminals. You know what? People who were close to the Assad regime, who had a lot of money, they're going to buy their way into feeling secure in Syria. They already are. There's plenty of business people in Syria who were close to the Assad regime who are now fine with HTS because HTS needs their capital. So they're not going and like getting rid of the big high honcho who is a general over here. They're just letting their people go around and kill minorities and cleanse areas. And it's horrific. And instead of talking about that, everybody just wants to celebrate. How are you supposed to celebrate when you have the aftermath of Libya coming to Syria and the aftermath of Iraq happening in Syria right now? And when I think of Syria, Hassan, I think of Syria the way I think of Palestine. These are all colonial borders that were imposed on this region. I have family in Syria. I can drive to Damascus from Beirut in like 2 hours. You know what I mean? This is not a separate country to me. Just like I feel about Palestine. This is also a part of who I am. This is the region I come from. So on an emotional and a personal level, it makes me really sad to see Syria's social fabric disintegrating under this new regime. And, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But so far, it does not look good. And I feel that for those who purport to be pro-Palestine, you have to understand materially the importance that Syria played, that it's no longer going to play in the Palestinian struggle for liberation and resistance to imperialism across the region. And you also have to understand what's happening to people outside of a few neighborhoods in Damascus where everyone's still celebrating.
I want to shift the conversation a little over to Israel and the ceasefire. We've seen them, they're taking over some parts of Syria and they're still in Lebanon. They extended the ceasefire. But within Israel, there are some government officials who are resigning because they believe the ceasefire has hurt them. It's tarnished their image. They've failed to accomplish most of their military goals in Palestine and Lebanon, right? So, yeah, they might be taking over some parts of Syria, but and you believe the greater Israel expansion project is still their main goal, but how do they fix their image? I mean, well, what type of bold moves do you think they're going to make in the next couple of years to fix their image? Because their image has been destroyed to an extent.
So I think I saw they're gonna invest like $150 million or something in some like more Hasbara, what their word is for propaganda around the world. So that's what they're gonna try to fix their image by doing everything they did before, but more. But I'm not sure they can do that, Hassan, after 15 months of people's social media feeds being filled with not just dismembered Palestinian children, but also the heartlessness and cruelty of statements by Israeli officials advocating for genocide, and also videos by Israeli soldiers in Gaza, showing off their war crimes, bragging about killing babies, and then, you know, mocking the people who lived in the homes they took over and destroyed by wearing their underwear, women's underwear. After people around the world have seen this, I don't think Israel can fix its image. Everybody, the world hates Israel.
No,
The
no,
only reason Israel has support.
the public opinion has definitely shifted. And after what people have seen in the last 15 months, I agree with you on that. But what about militarily? Do you think they'll take any bold moves in the near future to,
the
to expand Israel? They're
Yes.
seeing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Israel is in its kind of like end stage of Zionism. And that's nice to hear, end stage Zionism, but they're not gonna go down without doing the dirtiest, most depraved things ever. I mean, historically speaking, any empire or any movement of supremacy or colonialism like this doesn't go down without doing as much destruction as possible on the way down. I think Israel's in a very messianic stage too. The people you mentioned who are threatening to resign from government or have are the religious Zionists who, want to expand all the way to Iraq. um, and this is the future of Israel. This is the future of the people who will be in charge of Israel. Uh, so yeah, I think I think they made a lot of bold military moves the last 15 months. They carried out a genocide in Gaza. They tried to do another ground invasion with Lebanon with double the force they used in 1982. And they're still in some Lebanese villages and still striking Lebanon whenever they feel like it. And they took out the entire like senior leadership of Hezbollah. They have, after getting a government that was friendlier to them in Syria, they still went ahead and did a bunch of land grabs, and they're talking about not leaving anytime soon. So I think you're gonna see way bolder military expansionism from the Israelis, and by the way, that includes in the West Bank. The Israelis, what they're doing in Jenin refugee camp right now is what their own foreign minister, their defense minister, Israel Katz, calls the Gaza method. He's been calling for the last year to use the Gaza method in the West Bank, and now that's what they're doing. They're even going after hospitals there and doing airstrikes and besieging people and kicking them out in mass and forcing them to walk, on these like death marches. Um, so I think that definitely they had a hit in Gaza when were forced to sign a ceasefire agreement that they just did not want, and now they're going to have to put off plans to settle it because they were really prepared to start doing that. But I don't think it's over. These people are committed to literally the bringing about the end times. Like, it's, like, even crazier than dealing with people who are also crazy settler colonizers, but, like, at least they deal on, like, the same planet as you. These people live on a different planet.
So you said, there were forces on that ceasefire, right? And so in Gaza, they forced us on that ceasefire. But the Jerusalem Post had they had posted an article saying that the biggest leverage that Israel had over the Palestinians was it limited the Palestinians traveling from south to north because they were clearing Hamas. Now they're saying Hamas is back in the north with the civilians. So do you think the IDF the IDF would use that as an excuse to attack North Gaza
They
again?
will again. Yeah, they will again. They won't. I don't know if they will yet, but they absolutely will again. That's like laying the foundation for a future where they can strike whenever they want. It's not over. This is just a respite. It's not over. Will it be as bad as it was for the last 15 months? I'm not sure because I don't have a crystal ball. But this was the most ferocious of many more rounds to come. Uh, because Israel is a conquering settler colonial entity that is committed to constantly expanding. And in order to do that, they have to kill as many Palestinians as possible and destroy as much as they can and then take their land. That's literally what it's done its entire existence.
We've seen Trump put out some suggestions about different countries taking Palestinian refugees. I think he mentioned Egypt, Jordan. I read something like about Albania. I'm not sure how credible that was. And you mentioned right now the West Bank, and some people believe like within the next 2 to 4 years, they're going to try to clear out Gaza and the West Bank. That's what we've been reading. Do you think this is Israel and America's plan over the next several years, is really just clearing out these Palestinians to try to take as much Palestinian land as possible?
That's definitely Israel's plan. The question is, can they do it? We just witnessed the last 15 months of the most powerful countries in the world throwing everything they could possibly muster at exterminating Palestinians in Gaza. And then we just saw a few days ago images of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians going back to northern Gaza. They failed. They failed in that mission.
I read a stat that said like 40% of families in Gaza are raising children that aren't even theirs.
That's just insane. Like the story, I mean, it's just insane to me, the horrors out of Gaza. And you hear stories like that and it breaks your heart and really shatters your soul. But then you see that still wasn't enough to make people never return. Like nothing will change the images we saw from 2 or 3 days ago when Palestinians in the hundreds of thousands walked back on foot to northern Gaza after everything that's happened. There's an attachment people have to their land that they're not going to give up on. Also we have to keep in mind the Egyptians and Jordanians, this is a red line for them. The Egyptians will absolutely, if they didn't allow Palestinians in for 15 months, why would they suddenly allow it now when Gaza's not being relentlessly carpet bombed anymore? It's a red line for the Egyptians for security reasons. For them, having a bunch of Palestinian refugees in the Sinai is a security threat. That they view it as a security threat. Hamas to them is it's a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's like their number one enemy. They're not going to allow people who might be Hamas. That's how they see it. To set up shop in the Sinai. They're not going to let it happen. There's not any amount of money you can give the Egyptians, I don't think, for them to allow Palestinians in Gaza to be ethnically cleansed into Egypt. And it's a threat to Jordan too, to accept all those people. They're not going to do it. This is going to be a red line. And the Americans understand that. I mean, Joe Biden tried to sell that early on in the genocide in Gaza, and he quickly realized it wasn't going to happen. And so just, Donald Trump repeating it doesn't make it so.
You mentioned, it might be Israel and America's plan to completely clean out Gaza, maybe the West Bank, and the West Bank might be a little more vulnerable and whatnot. However, it probably won't happen. There's too many Palestinians and they don't want to leave their land. But also with the resistance, what do you see moving forward with all the resistance groups? You got the resistance you got some form of resistance in the West Bank. You got Hamas in Gaza. You got Hezbollah. You have the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, so what do you see the resistance doing over the next several years?
So with Hamas in Gaza, I mean, after 15 months of relentless genocide, we saw them come out in clean uniforms to bring back those Israeli prisoners they had in exchange for Palestinian hostages. They were and they looked to be in okay shape. Hamas still exists. Until the very end, they were still battling the Israelis in the most brave ways imaginable, you could say. Because, I mean, when you got guys going up to tanks and putting grenades on them, what's more brave than that? So Hamas still exists. It's been degraded. It's lost a lot of its leadership. So it's going to have to rebuild. But now you have a population full of traumatized people who've all lost family, who want revenge, and they're going to be happy to join a resistance group. So, there's going to continue to be resistance, fierce resistance in Gaza. And in Lebanon, you had a lot of losses as well, but you had 75 to 80,000 Israeli troops that tried to invade Lebanon. And these fighters on the ground were able to stop them with far less weaponry than the Israelis have. I mean, the Israeli,
how many Hezbollah fighters are on the ground stopping?
I have no idea how many were on the ground, but it definitely wasn't 75,000, I don't think. And not only that, like the Israelis, they have tanks, they have fighter jets, they have drones, they have AI, they have surveillance of communications, they have radar, they have, all the best, most high-tech weapons you can ask for. And then they also have like 8 layers of different kinds of air defenses. I mean, the level of defenses the Israelis have is insane. Sometimes when you think about what like the resistance size has and what the Israelis have, it's like butter knives and machine guns, like fighting each other, literally, in terms of like the technology. But that said, they still were able, the Israelis couldn't occupy southern Lebanon. They couldn't invade past a few kilometers. They tried and they couldn't, and they lost soldiers, and they eventually had to give up, you know? So it's just, it's anyone who thinks Hezbollah is over or the resistance is over is deluding themselves. Also, anyone who thinks that the resistance is like stronger than it was 5 months ago is also deluding themselves. There were a lot of losses, but there have been losses before, and people have recovered from the losses, learned from the losses, and rebuilt and come out stronger. So there's going to be resistance still. Absolutely. What it looks like in 5 years from now and 10 years from now, I mean, I can't tell you that. Like, I can't, predict the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that there has been resistance to Israel since it was imposed on this region. And compared to when it was imposed on this region, and now we have a way more organized and effective force of resistance, whether you point to here or there, than existed in 1948 or in 1982 or, throughout the 90s or even back, in the early 2000s and 2006. Like, we shouldn't discount. I mean, the day before or 2 days or the day before the ceasefire in Lebanon took effect, I think Hezbollah fired like 350 missiles at the Israelis. Like, they still are able to fight and launch missiles. That hasn't ended. So resistance still exists. It's still pretty well armed. It's still very well organized, and it's not going to go away.
Well, Rania, I want to thank you for joining us on TMJ News. Hopefully we'll do this again soon. And I ask you, please be safe and enjoy your stay in Lebanon.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I really appreciate it.
Have you been liking what you see here on TMJ News? If so, like and share this video and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more content. TMJ News is grassroots independent media. You can support our work in the caption below. Thank you for joining me on this latest episode, and I'll see you next time.